Hello, world, and welcome to the Pop Discourses, where we explore popular notions in the long conversation. I'm your host, Humboldt Ben. Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes, oh yes, gather round, come forth and listen, all those that would attend to the Flaming Heart. This is the Pop Discourses pilot episode number 9, Loose Ends. We're gonna tie up some loose ends. So, I know many of you may be mystified if you've been following this podcast about who this Giambattista Vico is. I know we've been inferring a metaphysics of emotion from his work as considered by Norman O. Brown, and that being a volume of philosophy entitled The New Science, written in the early 18th century in Naples, Italy. And Naples, of course, was a seaport, and it also was the place of the birth and education. Giordano Bruno, the great heretic, burned at the stake earlier on the timeline because of his, how shall we say it, iconoclastic attitude toward the doctrine and practices of the church and state of Italy during the time of the heyday of the Venetian Republic. And Vico, who was Vico? There is an autobiography out there. It's an autobiography that's cited by Professor Brown in his introduction to Vico in Closing Time, translated by Fish and Bergen, the same people that translated the New Science, and published by Cornell in Ithaca, New York in 1963. So what we can tell from that is that Vico had suffered a head injury as a child, and the physicians of the day didn't have much hope for him, but he did develop as a studious individual, though cantankerous, and to the extent that he became a professor at the University of Naples, also known as the Royal University, where he labored and bickered and argued and developed his studies over the time till he reached such an age where he was secure in his chair at the university and decided to synthesize all the studies he had conducted over the years to justify his trail of arguments, and that's what the new science is. And it's an academic work, and it cites history and precedent and ideas. And what we noted previously is that it seemed to point to a cyclical theory of history, but I'd like to suggest that perhaps the use of history in the context of that analysis is really allegorical to the individual, because how could there be a metaphysics of emotion without a center in individuals? And so, what we're really looking at is the development of the culture that exists in a larger media. Just to kind of reference our contemporary heuristic, the heuristic developed by Marshall McLuhan, that the media is the message. But we're looking at the institutional support of the emotional body of individuals and the projection of emotions onto their current circumstances. That's how I'm taking what Professor Brown is inferring in his work Closing Time, and drawing the study from Vico for James Joyce and Finnegan's Wake and the atomistic emotional tale that unfolds in that vast epic tome describing the media and culture of Dublin in, let's presume, the early 20th century. But I do have something I'd like to read in further elaboration of that point, and it comes from the introduction to the new science. And I'm going to suggest that it's been written by Max Harold Fish in this Cornell edition. This is what he has to say. Quote, "The controlling methodological postulate of Vico's new science is that doctrines or theories must begin where the matters they treat begin. This is to assume that genesis, or becoming, is the essence of that which the new science treats, that, at least for the new science, nascence and nature are the same. If we are not ready to grant this as a postulate for all science, we may perhaps grant it provisionally within the scope of Vico's new science. Once we grant it, we are prepared to expect that the common nature of nations will turn out to be or to involve an ontogenetic pattern exhibited by each nation in its origin, development, maturity, decline, and fall." End quote. Now that there's a start. He goes on to say, the first sentence of the next paragraph, quote, "A nation is etymologically a birth, or a being born, and hence a race, a kin, or kind, having a common origin, or more loosely, a common language and other institutions," close quote. And it's in that context, perhaps, that common sense also arises. But in the context of that broader media, exists the individual, who, of course, is the seat of emotion. And so, what we see, and I'm suggesting, and I'm going to say more about this, that from the core of emotion and the structure of the individual, genetically, physically, emotionally, intellectually, and then spiritually, there are certain choices to be made in terms of what the individual takes in and how an individual character is structured in the context of environment. But there certainly is the organism, the holism of the human individual. I mean, in the context that we're considering, that is primary, it precedes, it's foundational to any experience. And so the superstructure of culture, or whatever the conventions or traditions or the customs that the individual encounters in the course of his or her existence, is really the field of metaphysics, perhaps what Desjardins in the phenomenon of man begins to see as being amplified, moving on a linear scale, as the mind sphere or the nous sphere. But it's so easy for those who promulgate the rules of culture that exist within a media, and they say in the modern media understanding that politics are downstream of culture. But where does this leave the individual? Now, of course, in the feudal dimension, which we're taking as a road marker, a sign along the road, the individual is considered to be a property of some authority, some half god, some Caesar, some czar, some Kaiser, some Caesar, and that the authority doesn't rest in the individual, but instead rest in these representative offices entitled to receive the flow of materiality in that system. Food, the jewels, the building materials, the energy sources, etc. But in the revolutionary period, as these royal figureheads were diminished, and their retainerage, as it were, in the clerical classes was disempowered, we see a metaphysic of individuality developing. And so we begin to see a recognition that the emotionality of the individual really stands as the basis of all culture, no matter what form it takes. And so when we see something like the Bill of Rights and the Constitution of the United States, we begin to see some formal recognition in government. It's a milestone. That's the word I was looking for earlier. A milestone in the formal recognition of individual existence, where rights inure in individual citizens. And of course, we can also mark the expansion of the concept of citizenry moving forward from the revolutionary period of the late 18th century. So that's what I have to say in terms of trying to flesh out why Vico, as a conceptual keystone to the work of Norman O. Brown in looking at Finnegan's Wake is so crucial. And so the phrase that Brown seizes on in Finnegan's Wake as a marker with respect to the evolutionary recognition in government of the rights of the individual is the phrase, "Here comes everybody." Everybody a king. That may be the wrong way to say it, but in any event, that's what this expose, this novel expose in narrative form of the fundamental emotional landscape of individual culture in Finnegan's Wake represents is the emergence of the recognition of the core being of humanity in the genetic emotional body of individuals, the organic holism of individual human beings, and of course, taking that recognition into the animal kingdom is another potential movement as well. So, the new science of Giambattista Vico. And of course, we've just scratched the surface, and these remarks are introductory. But the question is that in the course of the development of a nation in its beginning, when a disconnect occurs between the rhetoric and expressions and laws, as it were, of a certain class of people who would deem to govern others, at what point does recognition of the sole truth of human existence, the individual, and the spiritual wholeness that each individual represents, when in the confrontation of the authoritarian, rhetorical, prosaic imposition, will language turn to recognize the truth of how nations are constituted? Well, that's one loose end from the last few episodes. Another is the loose end that considers this historical framework that was suggested in the title of last week's episode. And what I had called it was Warlord Chief Trading Partner. And in point of fact, the correct sequence may be Chief Warlord Trading Partner. But in any event, I don't know if there's anything correct about that, except that perhaps it is a descriptor of the emergence of government and global or foreign affairs. It's really a sequence that arose in a presidential debate, and I don't remember whether it was in 2000 or in 2004, uttered by the then candidate George W. Bush in describing his perception of foreign policy. And so, of course, it's an accurate perception from the point of view of a governmental entity that is focused on centralizing authority and enriching the governing. Though it may not be particularly apt as a descriptor of the potential of a productive society where resources are distributed among individual and trading it occurs on many levels and on multiple fronts, as it's just not centered in a central regulated economy and government. Now, of course, we don't expect that that's what we have in the United States, where traditionally in the late 20th century, the comparison to the 5-year plans of the Soviet Union and the so-called capitalism of the United States was often juxtaposed. However, it's instructive to hear this sequence set forth by President Bush in his candidacy, 43 in his candidacy. Let's say it this way: chief warlord trading partner. Now that's an odd perception of policy to promote, but there he was, out front and center. Speaking and representing that view, a view that certainly seems to minimize the role that any individual might have. Well, I know there's some other loose ends out there, but I did want to just take this time to address those in particular, advance the work of this podcast. We're still in the pilot phase, pilot episode number 9, and a lot of kind of ideas. I'm not sure this is getting a lot of traction, but I certainly appreciate the opportunity to refine my thinking about what's necessary in this era where there appears to be a rise of authoritarianism. And it seems appropriate to suggest that maybe this should be examined on all levels, including the metaphysical level. So that's what I have today. Chop chop, drink up. You can't stay here. It's closing time.